Hey everyone, welcome to the identity portion of the masterclass and the V2 version of this. Identity is critical. When we think about the world today using resources, our digital identity, well, that is the security perimeter in modern systems. Most of the applications we access no longer live in the confines of our network. They're on someone else's network. They're out there accessed over the cloud. And so it's the identity that is the key to opening up our access. So identity is more important than ever when we think of any kind of modern computing. And we think of identity, it's not just users, it's devices, it's applications. So we're going to explore all of the different areas of that. So think about what are some of the basics around identity, and then what is Active Directory domain services versus Azure Active Directory. Thinking about authorization, controlling access to applications that trust our Azure Active Directory through things like conditional access. How can I have strong authentication with multi-factor authentication, MFA, and passwordless? How can I get permission just in time? So I want to remove credentials and permissions that I'm not using and only get them when I actually need them. And we'll look at some other things as well. Things about, hey, how Azure AD relates to subscriptions, federation, access reviews, just some all-up understandings of identity. So why do we need identity? Well, for any service, whatever I'm accessing, be it SharePoint or Exchange or Azure or third-party SaaS applications, I have to be able to apply a principle of least privilege. I only have permission to do the things I absolutely have to do at that moment in time to perform my function. And again, when we talk about the service, the principle, this could be a user, it could be a machine, it could be an IoT device, it could be an application. Doesn't matter what it is, I want to be able to uniquely identify the principle that's performing some action. And I don't like shared accounts. With shared accounts, I get no visibility into, well, who actually performed that action. I can't audit, and I can't be granular because if I'm sharing an account, that account has to have the sum of the permissions of all the different actors that may be using it. So I want this least privilege, which means every principal, every actor has to have their own unique identity. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to give certain actions, and typically we take actions or permissions and we group them together into roles. And I want to assign that to specific security principles, be it a user, a group, a device, an application, at a certain scope. So we don't just think least privilege in terms of what I can do, we think of least privilege in terms of, well, what I can perform those actions against. Now we're going to focus on the security principles when we talk about Azure Active Directory, where those identities actually live. Any actor, remember, should be uniquely identifiable. That's a core tenet of everything we're doing. And if I think about, well, I need identities, I have to have some central storage of where those identities live. And then where those identities live would be responsible for making sure some actor is allowed to use that identity or is that identity through maybe knowing some secret or having some private key associated with a certificate, and then controlling, well, what it can then access. So if I think of those things together, I could think, well, I need an identity provider. So I have the idea of an identity provider, and that identity provider is responsible for storing those credentials. So I'm going to have credentials that has some way to authenticate, I prove I am that credential. Maybe it's got some secret, like a password. We're used to that idea. And then what will happen is various applications will trust that identity provider for its control of access. So hey, I'm going to trust the identities in this identity provider. And then once that's told me, oh, here's a token for this person, I trust this identity provider to have done a good job. If they've got a token, I know it did the right checking, and then I can control, well, what can it actually do? Some roles within this. So this identity would then have certain roles for this particular application. And then that person or device or application would authenticate, i.e. prove they are allowed to act as that identity by knowing this secret, by having that private key. And then the identity provider will give them a token. So it will give them a token because they've proved they're allowed to use this identity. And then they will give this token to the application that trusts this identity provider. And that's the key idea when we think about this. And I drew one application, but what you're typically going to find is you have many applications trusting the identity provider. So this is the key point. I need this central identity provider that's going to have all the identities that actors, users, devices, apps will be able to authenticate against, to get tokens to then use to authenticate and then be authorized for different sets of permissions against apps that trust our identity provider. So the whole thing here is I have to have this central identity provider. Well, there's actually some movement when we think about this. Because what's happened is, do I really need an identity provider? There's a whole decentralized identity movement happening right now. It's really gaining a lot of momentum. The idea really is the user becomes the center of that picture. If we go back to that whiteboard, what's in the middle? What's in the middle is the identity provider. It holds all the power. It holds the identity. So technically, it could delete that identity. And then I lose access to all my apps and all my data. It could give it to someone else. It could do a poor job and leak my credentials, and then someone else could do things with it. It controls maybe what the other apps can see. So do I have great control of my information about me and my data? Maybe not as good as I would like it to be. And so the idea of decentralized identity is it puts the user in the center of that picture. So the idea becomes the user or the other entity. It doesn't have to be a user. It could be an organization. But the entity owns their own identity. It controls the information shared. And then other entities can issue verifiable credentials to that identity. They would be the subject, that the subject can then choose to present to other entities. They would be verifiers, receiving parties, but they can control, as the owner of that identity, the user can control maybe what identities it wants to share. It can control maybe which parts of that. So maybe it doesn't expose how much I earn, but it can expose, oh, yes, I am employed by this company. It can expose, yes, this person is over 21, but doesn't expose their date of birth. So we can do a lot of things with this. And this is all rooted in some kind of trust system, because when you take away the IDP, because the IDP was the trusted party, if there's no direct relationships, how does that receiving party, the verifier, know, well, this verifiable credential, this attestation from some issuer really came from them? How do I know you are really you? So there's a whole trust system that forms the foundation of this. So if this is all built around an IDP, if I think about decentralized identities, the whole point of decentralized identity is in the middle is the actor. So I'll say me. So in a lot of ways, I am my own identity provider. But the whole problem with this is no one trusts what I say about myself. People trust other organizations. They trust government. They trust banks. They trust educational institutions. So if I just tell some verifier, oh yeah, I'm this age, they're going, I don't trust you. Same as in the real world. it's not really what I say about myself, it's about what some trusted party, my driving license says. That's what people trust. And so the point here is we have the same idea of some company, some government institution, but they are the issuer. And all of these different parties, we're going to have something be called a decentralized identifier, a DID. So everyone has this decentralized identifier. So this is not a decentralized identity. There's a difference between what these things mean. It's a decentralized identifier. And what's happening is there's some trust system. Now the actual trust system can vary. Some of them are built on blockchain. Some of them are built on combinations of layers of interplanetary file systems, which is then rooted in a blockchain. Some of them are based on owning a certain domain, and there's different ways to do this. But they're all rooted in some trust system. And now what will happen is this issuer, well, they will create a verifiable credential. So that verifiable credential they create, they will make some claims about the subject. So remember, the subject is me, so I am the subject, and they are the issuer. So they're the issuer of this. Then they give it to me. So they give me this, and I will then store this in my digital wallet. And now when I want to use it, there's some verifier. Maybe it's someone I'm trying to get a job at. Maybe it's, doesn't matter, it's a coffee shop. They're going to challenge me, and they're going to want a verifiable presentation. So I can now pick which of these verifiable credentials that are in my wallet do I want to share with them. So I now have all the choice. I can say, well, I'll present this one. I'll sign it with my credentials that I have, my decentralized identifier. And what they can do is they have a DID as well. So they have a DID, which is rooted in the trust system. And when they get this credential, they can go and consult the trust system to look up this DID, look up my DID, verify they have the right cryptographic materials, and validate, hey, this really did come from this issuer. I really am me. So this idea of decentralized identities using decentralized identifiers and DID documents, there's a whole set of things around this. I did an 1.5-hour video all about verifiable credentials, but this puts the actor in the middle, not the identity provider. I have complete control now over my identity. So this is a direction. This is happening. It is gaining a lot of momentum. So over time, you definitely will start to see more and more about this idea of, hey, verifiable credentials. So this is what it is. There is no centralized IDP. I have my wallet, which is just some user agent, some application on a device. It might be backed up to the cloud, but I maintain the control of the identity. And that's the key part. So it's just a little bit of a segue just to make sure you understand that typically we do think about a centralized identifier, identity provider, and that is what Azure AD is. But realize this decentralized identity movement is happening, but we're not really going to focus on that anymore. Microsoft Entra does have a solution for those verifiable credentials, both issuing and verifying them. And we'll see bits of Entra as we go through this module. But we are going to focus on this module around a centralized identity provider. So if you want to think about a centralized identity provider, enter Azure Active Directory. Now I will say, I mentioned the word Entra. Microsoft are moving a lot of their identity solutions under this Microsoft Entra umbrella. So Azure Active Directory. If I think about the verifiable credentials, some of the identity governance solutions, more and more things that are identity related are going under Entra. They purchase CloudKnox, and there's an Entra permissions management set of solutions. So if you hear Entra, it's an umbrella for a lot of identity related Microsoft technologies. So this is the idea. But Azure AD is the identity provider for, well, Microsoft clouds, yes. So if I'm using Azure, if I'm using Microsoft 365, so Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, Teams, if I'm using Dynamics 365, it all trusts a specific Azure AD instance that I have for my company, but also third-party SaaS applications, software as a service apps. It could also be applications I write. So many things now will leverage these identity providers for the cloud. Now, before I go into, I guess, more detail about this, it's important to understand Azure AD is not Active Directory domain services in the cloud. It is completely different. I think marketing said, oh, people like Active Directory, we'll use that name, but it's not. If I think for a second, if I actually look at Active Directory, so the Active Directory we know and love. So if I think of Active Directory, and its full name is Active Directory Domain Services. So what do we have with Active Directory Domain Services? Well, it speaks protocols like NTLM. It speaks Kerberos. If I want to interact and query it, well, I can use things like LDAP. It uses a huge, vast range of different ports to communicate because it's designed to run on a certain network. So I'm not that worried about ports I might need for this to actually function. It supports organizational units. So I have OUs, so I have a structure. And I can apply group policy objects. I can do delegation at those levels. And that's great for when I'm on premises, when I have that. But if I then start to think about, well, there are those cloud workloads. So I am starting to use some SaaS application. I don't want to have a separate identity. So one of the things I could do is I could set up some kind of federation solution. For example, ADFS, but there were third-party ones. And I could federate. And what federate lets me do is now this application will trust tokens generated from this federation service. It typically will be SAML or WSFed if it's more Microsoft focused. It's trusting this for the authentication, and then it would give the user some token that it would use. But there's a fair amount of work for this. I have to maintain this ADFS infrastructure. I have to maintain certificates with the people I have federations with. I have to have internet-facing services. So this, although is a solution, and it definitely avoids me having to have separate credentials on these SaaS apps, there's a lot of work to maintain these federations. So if I think in this new world of cloud applications and wanting to, hey, use the cloud for things, the solution is therefore Azure AD. So what Azure AD does, if I think of Azure AD, and it is not AD in the cloud. Forget about that. Azure AD is all based around HTTP, HTTPS. So it speaks web protocols. It speaks things like OpenID Connect for authentication. It speaks OAuth 2 for authorization, for delegation. It speaks SAML. It speaks WSFed. So these are all great to use over the internet where maybe I only have port 443 open to me. It's designed to speak cloud, and that's really the key point around all of this. So it's speaking cloud. And then when I think about all these other cloud applications, this could be Azure, this could be Microsoft 365, Dynamics 365, whatever that is, third-party SaaS, they all can trust the Azure Active Directory. There are thousands of apps, both Microsoft and third-party, that trust Azure AD. So now it's very, very easy for just me as a user, hey, I just communicate to my Azure AD, I get tokens from Azure AD, and I can use any app that my administrators have set up to be available to me. So I have a huge amount of control with that. And this is really the key goal around this cloud service. Now, it doesn't have organizational units. There's no hierarchy I can leverage in there. I can add my own applications. I can even publish on-premise applications via Azure AD. So there's a huge amount of things I can do with this. But this is the key point of a cloud identity provider. It speaks cloud, and it's making it really easy for me as an organization to make these cloud services available to all the people in my company. Now, when I think of Azure Active Directory, there are different SKUs, and there's licensing associated with it. If we quickly had a look at this, come on, open up. Here we go. So if we look at the licensing for a second, I'll just jump over. Do you know, it's great when it does this new big screen thing, but it behaves weirdly sometimes. So we'll see there's actually this idea of a P1 and a P2 license. There's also free. So if we look at the different SKUs available, it will show us the features. So absolutely, I can just do free. There's also the idea of, well, there's free, and if I'm a global administrator, I have all permissions over that Azure AD instance. Then there's the idea, well, maybe I have Office 365 deployed, and I'm using Office 365 applications. Then we have this Azure AD Premium P1 and P2. And it's really those P1 and P2 features that start to get you a lot of the enterprise functionality. Now you'll see, even with free, if I have this thing called security defaults, I can still do things like MFA using a special Microsoft Authenticator application. Global administrators could also use a phone call as a second factor or SMS. But it's when I get to the Azure AD Premium P1 and P2 SKUs, I get a lot of the power. I get the ability to do things like conditional access. That's a huge one we're going to talk more about. And then the P2 is really those enterprise scenarios where I think about, well, risk-based. So identity protection, understanding the context of what something's being done. So I can use that for conditional access. I get information about risky sign-ins or risky users. I can do access reviews to check, well, do I need this app? Do I need this group membership? Do I need this role? Giving sets of entitlements via packages, just-in-time elevation. So P2 gives me additional functionality beyond just the basic, hey, I maybe want to do MFA, I want to do some basic conditional access. And so we have those different licenses. And the way I use those licenses is actually at a per user level. So for each user, and I could do it via group as well. So if I think my Azure AD has users in there, it has groups in there, it has devices in there. At a per user level, I set the license. So I might have some user that is P1. I might have a different user, well, they need a P2 license. Now I could grant those licenses directly to the user. I could grant them via group memberships. Hey, you're in this group, you assign a license to the group, and then the people will just get those. So there's different ways I can think about organizing it. But Azure AD becomes that central identity provider. Now, how do you get it? So if this is Azure AD, how do you get Azure AD? Well, you probably have it already. If you're running Office 365, Microsoft 365, Dynamics 365, if you're using Azure, you have Azure AD. Because Azure AD is the directory service for those clouds. There is no Office Azure AD. There is no Dynamics Azure AD. It's using Azure AD. So you have it already. I can manage the objects through the Azure portal. I can actually manage it through the Entra portal as well. I should really update this slide. I can manage aspects of it through the Office portal. If I'm mainly an Office organization, it does expose a lot of the aspects of it through the Office portal as well. I can create additional Azure AD tenants. I can really create as many as I want. By default, they'll have a something.onmicrosoft.com name, but I can add a custom name as well. So if I think about, I drew this idea of Azure AD, well, the reality of this actually is your Azure AD is some tenant-specific name. So you create an instance, a tenant of Azure AD. And it would be, I would pick the name. It would be my organizational name. So maybe I would pick, for example, I'll just say tenant. So I have tenant dot on Microsoft.com. I can optionally add custom DNS names. Saviltech.net, saviltech.com, whatever you want to do. Because then the users, well, their usernames will have this domain name at the end of it. John@saviltech.net. I don't want it to be john@saviltech.onmicrosoft.com. So I can go and add custom names to my tenant. So if we jump over for a second. Now there are two portals now. I can go in the Azure portal. So you can see I'm in the Azure portal. I'm in portal.azure.com here at the top. And I could go and select Azure AD from the menu bar. So I'm in Azure AD, and I can see the basic overview information of my tenant. And one thing I will say while I'm looking at this overview, pay attention to your secure score. If you're starting out, remember identity is the new security perimeter. So you want to get your identity as rich and as full-featured as possible. So go and look at your secure score. It will give you things that impact your score, and it will help you do it. So I can go and click on it, and it will tell me how I should implement this, steps to do it. So if you're not sure where to start, hey, go and look at the identity score, go and look at the things that are going to have the biggest impact to improve your score, and think about, well, how do they fit into my plans? So I can use the Azure portal, but then there is also this Entra portal. So if I go to entra.microsoft.com, it brings together all of the identity related services. So if I go home, you can see, well, it's got the Azure Active Directory. It's got the Entra Permissions Management, which was CloudKnox. It has Entra Verified ID, which is about the issuance and validation of verifiable credentials. It has workload identities and things like workload identity lifecycle workflows, so that it can actually do things automatically. Identity governance actions. So it has a whole set of these services just available through this nice new portal. And I can go through here. I can see an overview. Oh, yeah. I can see information. And the same things, it's the same information. But if I was just to jump back for a second to the Azure portal and just go home and create a resource, if I search for Azure Active Directory, notice we can see Azure Active Directory. If I go and click Azure Active Directory, I could go and create a new Azure Active Directory. And it's going to say, is it Azure AD or is it Azure AD B2C? We're going to come to the B2C later on, but this is, you would create it the same way. Then it's going to want a name. What's my company name? Oh, I'll say Saviltech. What is the initial domain name? So this initial domain name, it's telling me whatever I type is going to be then .onmicrosoft.com. And then once I create it, I could then go and give it a custom name. And the way we do the custom names is once I've created my Azure AD, I'm just going to go to Entra. As part of my Azure AD, if I go to all of my different settings I have available to me, if I look at my settings, I have domain names. So I extended out settings and then domain names. I'll be very honest, I'm still finding my way around some of the Entra things, so I may struggle occasionally, but I can go to my domain names and I can add, so you can see here I added saviltech.net. Now the way you add one of these is you say, hey, I want to add a custom domain. You type in whatever it is, onboard to azure.com. I'll click add. Now after I do this, I'll then have to verify I really own that domain. So what it would make me do is go and create one of these two records, and then it will go and check, did I actually create that record? Because if I can create the record, it proves that I own that other name. So I can't just go and add any name I want. If I want to add a custom name, Microsoft want to know I actually own that domain name. So it's like, well, if you own it, you'd be able to go and create this record for me. So go and create this record. If you can create the record, I trust you. You are who you say you are. So that's the key point. So I can create additional Azure AD instances. Most of the time, you'll have one Azure AD instance for your main organization. Now, you may create a second instance, maybe for experimentation of certain things, but I'd be careful of having too many because I want to try and avoid having lots of different identities for my users. So typically we'll have this one identity, even across maybe production and development, and I'd only really have a second Azure AD for experimentation purposes. I want to try out this new feature or do this new thing, and I'd have a very small subset of users on there. So how do we get Azure AD? You probably have it already. Now within your Azure AD, you have objects. Now we talk about identities. An identity is any object to which I can authenticate against. I can prove I am or have the right to be that object. There's also things that I have a certain data available. So we have users. Users are obvious. Human being. And I can have those in my Azure Active Directory. So if I go to my Azure AD over here, I can go and look at my users. And I can see. And I could absolutely go and create a new user. Now it might be I want to create a user actually in the Azure AD. It might be I want to invite a user from an external company. So I don't want to invite an external user or create a user. Well, let's say I want to create a user. And then I would just, hey, type in information. Notice their name can be either that custom name I added or that default name. But I set my default as my custom, which is why it's doing that by default. I'd give it some information. I could give it certain group memberships. I'd give it certain roles, enter information about that user, and then create them. That's one option. Maybe I need to bulk create. So you'll also see this idea of bulk operations. And with bulk operations, I can bulk create, bulk invite, i.e. external people, and bulk delete. If I was to say bulk create, what it's going to do is give me a template for a CSV file into which I would then add the attributes of the users I want to create, and then I would upload the file, and it will bulk create all of those different accounts. So it makes it very easy to do those bulk type operations. Now, as we're going to talk about, most of the time your users probably come from Active Directory on premises, but I may still have some cloud only. We have groups. Groups can be assigned or dynamic. So what does that mean? So assigned is where I'm specifically putting identities into the group. John, Bob, Bill. Dynamic is I'm going to have a rule. And the rule says, well, if this matches, maybe it's an attribute on the user, then you're a member. So if I went and looked at groups, if I was to say new group, well, firstly, there's two different types. So security, this I can use as part of access control list, i.e. permissions to resources. Give it access to an application, give it access to assign a license. I could put users, devices, service principals, other groups as members of security. Or I could create it as type Microsoft 365. If it's Microsoft 365, it's there for collaboration purposes to Office resources. Hey, I want to share this SharePoint site. Hey, I want to collaborate on this calendar, this folder. And then only users can be members. So most of the time, we'll be creating security groups. And then I have the membership option. Assigned, I'm going to put people in it, or dynamic user or dynamic device. And if I select dynamic, well, then I enter a query which will govern who is added into the group. So it might be based on, hey, the city you live. Maybe I have these geographical different groups that access different resources. Maybe it's a menu for a certain cafeteria in that region. Maybe I have departmental. And then I can say, well, if you equal this value, then you're a member of this group. And you can see I've done this. So if I looked at my groups, you can see I have the group types, And then I have, is it dynamic on this right-hand side, or is it assigned? So if I look at my dynamic group, all cloud PCs, let's find a slightly different one. There's another dynamic one. iOS devices, Justice League. So my Justice League, well, I can see there are members, and the dynamic rule was if their job title matched hero wildcard. So it could be hero or heroine. Either one of those, hey, if you're a hero, then you're added to this group. And notice I could then assign things like licenses. So I don't have to individual add licenses to users. I could say, hey, if you're a hero, you get Azure AD Premium P1 or EMS E5 or whatever ones I have in my tenant. I could then go and assign to those individuals or assign via the group itself. So we have different options around that. So we have different types of groups. We have enterprise applications, Azure resources, i.e. service principals. And this is going to be very, very common. So we always think about users and groups, but the reality is these applications, well, if I have this federation relationship in my tenant, i.e. they're trusting me, those applications will actually have a service principal inside my Azure AD. So applications have their own object as well. Azure resources in my Azure subscription can have something called a managed identity. So it's an identity that lives in the Azure AD that is maybe unique to that individual resource if it's system assigned, or different Azure resources could share a certain user assigned managed identity. But those identities are just service principals and they live in the Azure Active Directory. So I may absolutely have applications in my identity provider, my Azure AD as well. So managed identities, devices. This is becoming more and more common as well. So I drew the idea of a person, but absolutely we have devices. Now these devices can run in different modes. It could be registered. If it's registered, it's known to the Azure AD, which means it could be then managed by things like Intune, some mobility solution to actually perform management of the device. We call them mobile device management, MDM solutions. So I could use MDM solutions, but I cannot authenticate or log on to that device as an Azure AD user. So I'm going to authenticate with something like a Microsoft account. Or I could join it. Now, if I join it, well, now I can actually auth as Azure AD accounts. Register would be useful for bring your own device. It's the user's own device. Hey, they're going to access corporate resources. So I want to be able to apply mobile device management, make sure it's not jailbroken, make sure it's patched, etc., etc. But I can't really join it because it's their device. Whereas join, hey, it's an actual corporate-owned device. Registered would work with Windows 10 devices, iOS devices, Android devices, macOS devices, Ubuntu 20 and above devices. Joined is only going to work with Windows 10 and above devices. And Windows Server 2019 if it's an Azure VM and if I'm running a certain extension. So the joined is a lot more locked down because it's becoming part of that Azure AD. Or there's also a hybrid option. So with hybrid, the device is actually joined to your regular Active Directory, but then you have a certain process we'll talk about that's going to synchronize and therefore register your device with Azure AD as well. And then I can get those MDM and some of those other benefits there as well. So there's different options available to us. And then additionally, stuff, metadata about applications. And what we will see is most of the time your users and groups are just going to come from Active Directory. So how do they come from Active Directory? So we have Azure Active Directory Connect, Azure AD Connect. AD is always the source of truth. And this is really important to understand. In all of these relationships, when you have AD and you have Azure AD, it often gets confusing and people will say, hey, how do I replicate objects from Azure AD to AD? You don't. Active Directory is always the source of truth. The flow of objects is that away. Now, there are a few things like in Hybrid Exchange. There are certain password write-back capabilities where it will flow that way. But 99.9% of what's happening is that away. Even if I attach a HR system and the HR system connects to the Azure AD provisioning service to create objects, what actually happens is the Azure AD provisioning service then talks to the replication engine to create the object in AD, which then syncs into Azure AD. So AD is always this source of truth. This is really the key point. And what's really happening with this Azure AD Connect, I can think of, it runs in a VM, or it runs on an OS, Windows OS instance. And there's a sandwich. There's a connector space, which represents the objects in my Active Directory. In fact, I'm going to draw it that way. There's a connector space that represents the objects in Azure AD. Then there's a metaverse where they're joined together. And like I say, there is a very minimal flow that way, but it's very, very small. Most of the flow is that away. So this is Azure AD Connect. There is also a cloud version now. So there's also an idea of Azure AD Connect Cloud Sync. And that takes this engine and runs it in the cloud. And all I have to do is install these very lightweight agents on a few machines on premises. That's just so it can access and read things, but most of the actual processing and the power is done in the cloud. So it removes me having to maintain this Azure AD Connect that can sometimes be thought of as a single point of failure because an Azure AD will only talk to one Azure AD Connect instance. Well, it can also talk to a staging, like a fallback, that I would have to manually promote up. But for the most part, there's just this one instance. Whereas with Azure AD Connect Cloud Sync, so it's one of them, or the engine runs in the cloud, and I have multiple agents on-prem that it can use to go and communicate with. Now, there are some different models for how I can use this. So Azure AD is always the source of truth. An Azure AD instance can only sync from one Azure AD Connect instance, an optional staging. But what is interesting now, one AD can now sync to multiple Azure AD instances. So what this means is from a topology perspective, imagine I had multiple Azure AD tenants. It used to be I couldn't handle it. But if we now look, there's a new scenario where I can actually run multiple Azure AD Connect instances. Each instance only talks to one Azure AD, so the same rule still applies. An Azure AD will only talk to one Azure AD Connect. But I could actually now sync to multiple Azure AD instances by using multiple instances of Azure AD Connect. Now, only one Azure AD Connect can write back. That's why there's only one green arrow going from Azure AD to AD. But what's really nice is those Azure ADs could be in different clouds. Now, what does that mean? What does different clouds mean? We talk about Azure all of the time, but Azure is made up of really regions. There are different groups of regions. There's the Azure Commercial Cloud that we all think about. There's also a Gov Cloud that only government agencies are allowed to use. It's completely isolated data centers. It's a completely isolated set of Azure AD instances. There's also Azure China. So there are different clouds of Azure. It's just we typically think of commercial. But what I could do is if I had a Gov tenant as well, I did work for the government or I am a government agency, I might have my regular commercial Azure AD tenant and I might have a Gov Azure AD tenant, where my Gov Azure resources or Gov SaaS applications trust, but now my one AD could sync to both of them. So that is now an allowed scenario. So that's a very nice thing. So we have our Azure AD Connect, and Cloud Sync provides that cloud-based version of that. We can quickly see these. So I actually have both running. Now the way I have both of them running is you can't replicate the same object. If I look at my Azure AD Connect, we can see my Azure AD Connect is enabled. But what I did, I excluded a specific OU from replicating with Azure AD Connect. And then what I did with Cloud Sync is I only sync that one OU with Cloud Sync. So I could technically use them together, but what's important is you can't have the same object syncing through two different means. So only the objects in the Cloudy OU sync using Azure AD Connect Cloud Sync, and Cloudy is explicitly missed and excluded from my regular Azure AD Connect. So that's the key point. So I have both of them running just so you can kind of see that. But Azure AD Connect is that engine. I can see different capabilities that I may have enabled, but I can see, hey, my last sync was less than an hour ago. I'm using password hash sync, which will mean more in a second. And I mean, I'm pretty good shape. So we've got Azure AD. We've got AD, they're connected. What do I do with it? We have authentication, we have authorization. Authentication, or auth-n, is about proving who you are. I prove who I am because I know something like a password. I prove who I am by something I have. Maybe it's my phone, maybe it's a USB token. I prove it by something I am, a biometric, a fingerprint, a 3D face scan, an iris detection. And then once I've proved who I am, authorization, or auth-z, is what I can do, what I can access, what actions I can perform. And both of those things are critical. Now for Azure AD, there's both cloud authentication, so cloud happening against Azure AD directly, and it supports federation. So the first one we can think about is password hash sync. Or the password, I mean, the point of this is the password exists in the cloud. So how does this look? So if we jump over, and we'll start a new little whiteboard, so we'll come over here. So we have Azure Active Directory. So I've got my Azure AD. And remember what happened is, let's say we had our on-premises Active Directory. Oh, green. We had our on-prem AD. I'm going to get lazy. I'll just write AD, but we mean AD domain services. I remember I had a user. I had a user, and I'm syncing that user using Azure AD Connect or Azure Connect Cloud Sync, and so the user has an object up here. Now in Active Directory, that user has a password hash. That's how you authenticate. You type in your password, it goes through a hashing algorithm, and then it's compared against the hash stored in AD. So what I can do is, one of the options is I can turn on hash of the hash replication. So it takes the hash, runs it through individual sorts, 1,000 iterations of SHA. I can't reverse it, but it creates a hash of the hash, and then I can replicate that up as well. So now there's a hash of the password in AD. So what that would now let me do as the user is, if I'm here, well, I can send my credential to Azure AD. So I'm doing cloud authentication, because Azure AD is performing that check of I am who I say I am, because It's comparing the credential that I send with the credential it has stored in itself. So this is called, when I'm doing this, it's password hash sync, because I'm syncing the hash of the hash. Now realize as well, if it was a cloud user, I just created them directly in Azure AD, they're not syncing, but they would have a password. They'd have their own hash up here. So I'd still be doing cloud authentication there as well. So that's one option. This is the nicest option. It's using cloud scale. It's not relying on anything else. It's going to be the most performant. And there's a lot of benefits in having this hash of the hash in Azure Active Directory. There's things it can do to check to make sure there's not been some leak, there's not been some bad thing happened to my credential. Now another option, I'm just going to run through these and then we'll go back to the slides, is I have domain controllers that represent this Active Directory. They're what power the actual Active Directory. So I have these DCs. Maybe I still want my authentication to happen against my on-prem domain controllers. There's a few things that password hash sync doesn't handle exactly the same way as on-prem. Logon hours, for example. Or maybe there's a scenario of, well, I don't want hashes in Azure AD, but that's not a good reason, and we'll come back to why that's not a good reason. Maybe there's also things like password expired I want to be enforced. Maybe account lockout. So I want the authentication to happen against my domain controllers. So what I can do here is I can turn on something called pass-through authentication. So with pass-through authentication, I'm still sending the credential against Azure AD, but then Azure AD writes that authentication request to a service bus. There are then agents sitting here that poll this and will take that request. They'll check it. If it's good, yep, that's the correct password. It will send back that success. Azure AD will then create the token and they're authenticated. So authentication is still happening against the cloud. I'm sending my credential to the cloud, but it does involve that on-premises as well. The other option is, maybe I'm running some federation service. This could be ADFS, could be a third party, whatever that is. It's now a different flow. Now what happens is I actually send my credential to my federation service. It will then go and check and get authentication against whatever my identity provider is. It will generate a token, like a SAML token. It will then give me that token back. And then I take that token and I would use that to then get a token from Azure Active Directory. So in all of these scenarios, what ultimately happens is Azure AD creates multiple tokens and gives it to me that I then use with applications. But how I do that initial authentication can vary. So those three options. We have this password hash sync. We have pass-through authentication. And this, well, it's federation. It just depends on where I'm sending that credential for the initial authentication request to go through. Now, I did them in a certain order, which is really the recommended order. Password hash sync is the better option. If I do have concerns over that, well, account lockout or some of those scenarios, or I don't want the password hash in Azure, well, then I could use password authentication. Federation is really just not recommended today because it doesn't buy you very much. We'll see later on that what's really happening is, yes, there are these benefits, but when I use federation, it's only used for that initial authentication. After the initial authentication, what I actually get is something called a refresh token, which is then used for every other authorization to every other application. So a federated service is only used for that initial authentication. It's then not used for any other access I want to do with things. So it's probably not doing what I think it's doing anyway. Now, I said, send the password hash sync anyway. And the reason is, when the password hash exists in Azure AD, there are things that Azure AD can do. For example, yes, password hash sync is required for cloud authentication, but also Azure AD is going and looking for leaked credentials. It's scouring the dark web. If it has this hash of the hash, even if I'm not using it for authentication, maybe I'm using pass-through, maybe I'm using federation, I can still opt to send the password hash to Azure AD. And then if it has this, if it finds a leaked credential on the dark web, it can compare it to that hash of the hash and say, hey, your credential's actually leaked. It's actually your password is there on the dark web. And it could alert you, it could maybe force an MFA, and it will stop a breach replay attack where they're trying to reuse that credential. It's also a good break glass, disaster recovery authentication if one of these break. Maybe my federation service breaks or my domain controllers have some availability issue, I can switch to use cloud password hash sync authentication as a backup authentication mechanism. There are various smart lockouts. There are these automatic defenses where it would lock out the Azure AD account before it would log out maybe an on-premises account. So there's a lot of benefits I get from doing this. So it's always recommended to send the hash of the hash, and it is a hash of the hash, even if I'm not authenticating with it. I can perform a staged rollout. So if I was using federation, I can move group by group to go to a cloud native. And all of these methods can use seamless or single sign-on. And what that really means is, if you think about my user is at a certain device, with federation, I'm authenticating against my regular on-premises Active Directory, for example. So I already have a Kerberos token for on-prem, so I can obviously access on-prem resources. And what single sign-on does, because Azure AD is trusting this for the authentication, well, it is just automatically generating me a token I give to Azure AD, so I get a single sign-on experience. I'm never prompted for another credential, so I get a single sign-on. But if I'm using password hash sync or pass-through authentication, there's something called seamless sign-on. And what this does is behind the scenes, and it works in two different ways, but for older clients, Azure Active Directory actually pretends it's a Kerberos client. It goes and gets this special Azure AD single sign-on account object in your AD. And so I actually authenticate using Kerberos to Azure AD, which seems bizarre, but it trusts the token from Kerberos. Or for newer machines, I actually get a primary refresh token. But whatever the scenario, for all three of these, for the user, if I have line of sight to Active Directory on-prem, I'm on a corporate join machine, I get transparent access to both on-prem trusting resource and cloud-based resources. And we can see I've got that in my tenant. So when I go and look, we can see I've got seamless sign-on enabled. So even though I'm using password hash sync, if I'm on a domain joined machine, my on-premises domain name, I can seamlessly access. I won't get prompted for credentials. I just get this very nice sign-on experience. And you want to enable this because you really do want to give users a great experience, and make sure you go and enable seamless sign-on. But again, as you start to move to Windows 10, Windows 11 devices that can have these hybrid, I actually get a primary refresh token for Azure AD. So it doesn't even have to go and use the old Kerberos-based authentication method at all. So there's some really nice things I can do there. So password hash sync, always recommended. If I'm using something else, which ideally get away from, get to the cloud native Azure AD. Even if you are, hey, have it enabled, helps give me that identification of leaked credentials, helps give me protection, helps be that backup auth method if my primary has some kind of problem. Now, authorization is always against Azure Active Directory, and we're going to see more about that. But if I think about, no matter how I'm authenticating, however I'm proving who I say I am, whether it's sending the credential to Azure AD, whether it's sending it to a federation service, once that initial authentication is done, the actual control of what I'm then allowed to use is always Azure AD. Doesn't matter. Once I've got that initial token, everything is now through Azure Active Directory. Now, roles and administrative units. Many built-in roles exist for both Azure AD, for Microsoft 365 services. And then roles can be given to users and potentially a special type of group. So the whole point here is I've proved who I say I am, but now I need to do certain things. So, okay, great. How do I do that? Complex applications may have thousands of permissions and different types of actions. I don't want to individually grant permissions and actions to individuals. Instead, what we think about doing is we create roles. So in my Azure AD, I have roles. And a role is really a set of permissions, a whole set of permissions. And then what I'm going to do is to a certain identity in that Azure Active Directory, so with certain user, it's primarily users, there is a special type of cloud group that does allow me to grant roles for Azure AD. Regular Azure roles I can give to groups, but Azure AD roles, normally I cannot assign to a group. I have to assign it to individual security principles identities. But there is a special cloud group that I'll show you that does let me assign. So I have a user, or I have an identity, or a cloud group, which has got people assigned. It cannot be dynamic. People have assigned into it. And that role, I assign to that security principle. But the key point is when I assign that role, well, I want to assign it with a certain scope. Traditionally, the scope was global. It was the entire Azure AD tenant. That's all I could do. So it was global. But we do now have the choice, or we have something called administrative units. So I have a role, I grant it, and it's set at a certain scope. Again, by default, that scope is going to be global. It's everywhere. So if we look at this quickly, I can see I'm going to go back to Entra. I can go and look at roles. So I'm down here. I can see my roles and admins. And I can see there's lots of built-in roles. There's all these different roles. Some of them are Azure AD. Some of them are related to Office. Some of them are Teams, you can see here. I can create custom roles. So if I look at a role, I can see who it's assigned to. But if I look at the description, these are all the individual permissions. You can see now why I wouldn't want to manually grant permissions. So that way I need these 47 over here. Nope. I'll group them into roles that have a nice logical name. Then I'll assign the role to a security principal. And by default, this is assigning it at the Azure AD level. So whatever permissions this role has, well, it's all of those matching objects within the entire Azure AD. I can create custom roles. If the roles that are there don't meet my exact needs, well, I can go and create a custom role, or I can specify the exact permissions I want it to have. Now today, custom roles are limited. They only apply around application registrations and enterprise applications. It's not general purpose, so this is fairly limited today. But if those are the scenarios I want to focus on, maybe I want to limit a type of enterprise app or specific actions, hey, I could create a custom role around that. And then with these roles, I assign it. And as you'll see, if I actually come out of that for a sec. Oh. If I let's just pick it and do add an assignment. When I select the target, it's showing me all my users, but it's not showing me groups. Except for, well, it did show me this group. It showed me one group, and I have a lot of groups. The reason is, as I mentioned, groups you can't assign roles to unless it's this super special type of group. So when you create groups, if it's a security group, you'll see this option. Azure AD roles can be assigned to this group. If I turn this on, notice the membership type is currently a drop-down. If I turn it on, it has to be assigned. It can't be dynamic anymore. It's individuals I have to put into it, but then I could assign a role to this, which is that one group that showed. I created it of that particular type, the cloud group role demo, so I could then assign it actual roles. I haven't actually granted any to it, but I could do it to that group. So that's how I do those role assignments. So this is global. This is assigning to everything. But maybe I don't want to do that. Maybe I want a more granular assignment. So that's where we have administrative units. So the whole point of administrative units are, I can create these administrative units, and into those administrative units, I can place specific users. I could place groups. I could place devices. And then I could give security principals like a user a role, but the scope would be only for the objects inside the administrative unit. The scope would not be global anymore. There's a few really, really important things about this. So I can't nest them, so there's no nesting. I can't put an administrative unit in an administrative unit. It's not for ACLs. I cannot give this permission to some resource. This is only for administrative purposes. If I want to give these things access to a resource, I create a group. When I add a group into an administrative unit, I am not giving this role permission to act on the members of that group. And that's really important. And you wouldn't want that. So if this group had 10 users in it, I don't get this role permission to the users in the group. I would have to add the users specifically as members of the administrative unit. Why is it like that? Well, if I got the role for the members of the group, I would just add users into the group so I could get permission to manage them. I might add an administrative user into the group just so I could then go and change their password. So it's very specific. I don't inherit the members of the group. I can manage the group name, for example. I can do attributes of the group, but it doesn't give me management of the members, the people in the group. I don't then get to manage them. I have to explicitly add the people into it. So if, for example, a group had a whole bunch of users in it, so if there was that user in it, and that user in it, and that user in it, etc., etc., I can't manage any of them. I would have to add the particular user into the administrative unit. So then I could manage the orange user, but even though all of them are members of the group that I can manage, I can't manage the yellow or the really orange or the purple one. I'd have to add them into the administrative unit. Users, groups, devices can be members of multiple administrative units. There's no problem doing that whatsoever. The list of roles that I can assign are not the complete set. If we go and look at it, we can see that, hey, I'll go and look at my administrative units. I could look at, I could do different membership types. If I add an administrative unit, I give it a name, let's do test. I could assign it certain roles, and it's a subset. Notice there's only a fairly small list of roles compared to the massive list that's normally available. But then what I can have here is I can have a dynamic membership rule. So this one, for example, is maybe I have office administrators. So I could say, well, if the city is this city, add them into this administrative unit, and then I would give someone the ability to manage only the people in this administrative unit. Or maybe I have departmental, so I would do if the department equals a certain value. Or I can just do static. I just assign the people into it, and then I assign the roles of that group. So I could give someone, maybe make them a password administrator for the people, maybe the help desk. They could be password administrator for this administrative unit, and they could reset the passwords only for that. In terms of licensing, I need a P1 license if I'm doing the administration of an AU, but I don't need a special license to be managed by an AU. So in create custom roles, normally I always think least privilege. No matter what I do, only give them the permission I absolutely have to do the job. Again, we talked about the scopes. Normally it's global, but I can use administrative units as well. There's also a My Staff site. So if I do have these lesser permissions, well, I probably don't want to use the Azure AD portal or the Entry portal. It's a bit overkill. Maybe I'm just a basic help desk or departmental admin. I don't understand all that stuff. So what My Staff does, it's a real scaled down site that will only show me the administrative units that I have permissions on. And then I can do very basic things for the objects within that administrative unit. I could reset the password, I could add a phone number, but that's it. It's very limited based on what my role is. So this My Staff site is really nice for some very basic interactions that I might want to do. So it's worth knowing that's there so you can go and play around. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Always think just enough permission. Which brings us to privileged identity management. Because those roles I was giving this role, you'd have it all the time. I don't like that. We don't like Windows. With Windows, we have that whole user elevation, user access control. Hey, I'm trying to do something that needs a powerful permission. It prompts you, hey, do you want to do this? People hated it in Vista because it prompts you every 4 seconds. It's got a lot better. But the idea is I'm an admin on my local machine, but it hides my higher permissions until I need it. And then if an app needs to do something that needs those higher permissions, it prompts me to elevate up to that higher set of permissions just in the context of that action. And then, hey, I lose them again. So this is the same idea. It enables me to elevate up to an Azure AD role or an Azure Resource Manager, i.e. Azure role, for a finite amount of time when I need it. I can also use it maybe to elevate myself into a group membership, and that group has certain roles for a finite amount of time. I have to pre-assign the roles. Basically what's happening here is I'm saying, I'm going to give you this role to be available to you that you can then elevate up into. So the whole point here is instead of me just having the role assigned all of the time, what I'm now saying, if I use PIM, so I now have privileged identity management, and the whole point of it is a just-in-time solution. Now, my user actually is given the right to elevate up. So I have my user, I'm still assigned a certain role, so I'm given the role to have the right to elevate up, but I don't have it by default. When I want to use it, what I actually have to do is I have to activate the role. And when I activate it, it's time bombed. Maybe it's for 2 hours. So it's time limited. I can then do tasks associated with that higher role, and I lose it again. So this is really powerful, this just-in-time capability. And this is really what is encouraged as much as possible. If we actually go and look at this for a second. So from here, and actually it's driving me nuts that I've got this other window up, so I'm going to kill that super quickly. Let me just kill this window because it's bugging me. There we go. So if I go back to my Entra for a second. So privileged identity management, this is a P2 feature. And you'll see all of the P2 features are under identity governance. So I'm in Entra, and I'm going to go to Privileged Identity Management. And now it breaks into different areas. I can think about Azure AD roles, Azure roles, and then this Privileged Access group. If it's an Azure AD role, well, I can do different things. Firstly, I can configure how each role works. So for billing administrator, I can say, notice there's eligible assignments and active assignments. So there's different ways I can assign these roles. Eligible, well, eligible means, let's go to role settings. That'll make it easier to see. So you see the assignment options. I can do allow permanent eligible assignment. So eligible means it's there and I can elevate up to it. I can also just make it active. So I'm actually granting it to them so they don't have to elevate up. Maybe I'm still using PIM so I can track it. I can maybe limit the amount of time, but it's just going to be available. So if I do edit, here we can see activation. It's available for up to maximum 24 hours, or I could reduce it. And notice I could say, look, when you activate, you have to do an MFA. I'm going to make you do a strong authentication. If you've already done a strong authentication, it won't make you do it again. But if I haven't, it's going to make me do a strong authentication. I can require approval. I have to enter a reason I'm doing it. So there's an audit track. Maybe I have to enter a ticket number. So I can select information about when I want to activate. I can say, do I want to allow permanent, i.e. they don't have to. So permanent active, it's just they're gonna have it. If I do that, hey, it can only be active for 6 months. Allow permanent eligible assignment. If I turn that off, then when I make them eligible to elevate up, it's only going to be available for maybe a year or 6 months. But I want it to always be eligible. Allow permanent. No, I don't want to let people have it permanently. So this is where it's active. They don't have to elevate up, but they'll only have it for 6 months. So I can give different informations and configurations for each of those. And then I would assign the roles to people. And when I assign it, so let's just pick someone. I pick. Am I assigning it as eligible? So again, eligible means they'd have to go into PIM and say, I want to elevate and activate that role. And then it will be available for them for 2 hours or 4 hours, and it will automatically be removed again. If I say active, they don't have to elevate up. It's just going to be assigned to them. And I could say, well, it ends at a certain time. I have to enter a justification. So maybe it's a contractor. They need these permissions day in, day out. It makes no sense to make them keep elevating, but they're only on this project for 3 months. So I'm going to give them this role for this project for 3 months, and then it's automatically going to go away because normally we forget and people just grant more and more permissions over time. So PIM can either, hey, you're eligible, you can activate up to it, or hey, it's active, but I can time bomb it. So they're Azure AD roles. I can do the same for Azure. Now for Azure, the way we're going to do this, by default, it's going to show me subscriptions, and this would be the scope I'm assigning the role. If I instead wanted to assign a role a resource group or management group, I can change the resource type, or even an individual resource, and then what I would do is I would select whatever that scope I want to assign the role at. So in this case, maybe I select too many here, but I'll be able to select, for example, a resource group. And then once I've selected the resource group, I would be able to, let's say I'll pick this resource group, and then whatever role I select here, they would elevate up just at that RG Bicep demo resource group level. And I have the same settings. I can go through and I could configure various things once it actually shows up. I think it's tired this morning. I could also see the various roles that are available at that resource group level that I could grant, and I could change the configurations on those. I don't know why, there we go. So I could just pick a certain role. Again, we have eligible assignments, active assignments. I could change the settings of this particular role. And once again, we get the types of activation, types of assignment. I can edit how I want to make those available. Do I allow permanent eligible? Do I allow permanent active assignments? So I have all of those controls available to me. And then the user experience of all of this is they would go into PIM, look at my roles, they would see a role they have, and they would say, hey, I want to activate it. So over here, I say, hey, I could activate this role right now. I could say, do I want to start it in the future? Or, no, I'll do it right now. I have to give a reason. And I would say activate. Then it's going to go through, it's going to give me that role. I'm going to get it for an hour. It'll refresh my token. And then I've just got it. And then I can start doing Teams-related things. And that's PIM. The whole point of this is for Azure AD roles, for Azure roles. And I could also elevate into a certain group. It's going to give me that for that time window only when I need it. That's a typical use. Again, I can just do an active assignment, but even then I can time bomb it. Notice it's refreshing, so it's getting me a new token that now has that permission. I can see it's active. My active assignments. And notice when I look at active, it shows me both the ones that I activated via PIM, and it will show me ones I just have permanently assigned to me. So I get that full view of all of those. So the whole point of PIM, hey, give me stuff when I need it. That's all it's about. So users elevate on demand or set it for a future time. I know I'm going to need it then. It is an Azure AD P2 feature. So I need a P2 license to actually leverage this. So we have entry permissions management. So if Azure AD PIM is all about the idea of, really it's premeditated. I know at some point in the future, these users are going to want to elevate up to this role. So I'm going to give them and pre-assign these roles. Entry permissions management, which was CloudKnox, and I've got a deep dive video on this, is more ad hoc. I need these specific permissions right now. Someone goes and gives permission to it, authorizes it. And again, it's time windowed. It goes and creates a custom role for these particular permissions and then deletes it. So this is really about this more ad hoc on-demand elevation. But it's super granular. It doesn't use regular roles. It can do, but I can actually check individual, those thousands of permissions, I can check individual ones that I actually want. And I can create my own custom templates in Entra for particular sets of permissions I might want to make easily available to those ad hoc elevations. It works across clouds. So this is Azure, it's AWS, it's GCP, Google Cloud Platform. But one of the things it does that's really nice is it will actually analyze usage. So it will say, I have these roles, I've used these permissions, I've never used these permissions, or you have these permissions, these are really considered high privilege, you probably shouldn't have them. And it will right size. It will recommend right sizing, creating custom roles with just the permissions you actually use, or just the permissions you should safely have, and fix up my environment. Because again, over time, if you think about a typical user, think of a typical user's life in any regular company. So I'm a user and I start a job. So I get role 1. Well, role 1 adds me these permissions and these access, okay? Then I change role, I get role 2. Oh, well, they add some other permissions, access, and they add some other permissions. Oh, they add some licenses as well. Oh, and then I get another role. How many times does your company go back and remove the things? It's really not done very often. So over time, we just get these ever ballooning set of permissions, which is what PIM is designed to address and Entra is designed to address. So that's really the goal of a lot of what we're doing, to try and avoid just this bloat happening to the environment and to trim down into just the things I actually need and the things that I should safely have. So that's the goal around what's trying to happen. It is a separate license, and the license is based on the resources it's scanning. It's not a per user license, it's what are the resources that it needs to go and look at to see, well, what permissions you have. Then we have access reviews. And this is really taking a different approach. If PIM is designed to say, hey, only keep what you have when you need it, access reviews are designed to say, well, that same picture I just drew, you get these constantly added membership of groups, access to application, roles, they just grow over time. Access reviews say, do you know what? Let's review those permissions. Let's review the apps you've got assigned. Do you still need this app? Let's review this group membership. Do you still need to be a member? Let's review this app assignment. So roles, apps, group memberships, and it could be the user self-attests. Yes, I still need to be in this. It could be some delegated person. They do a check. It could be some manager. I have different controls on who's doing the checks, but I create these access reviews to review those things, group memberships, app assignments, role assignments, and there's different people who can do that review. But the whole point is to validate, do you still need this stuff? It's not just ballooning out. And I can set them to automatically run every 3 months. So again, it's a P2 feature. It's under that identity governance, but now we have access reviews. And there are 3 different types, remember. So I see them in slightly different places. So for a new access review from this screen, I can review group memberships or application assignments. If I want to do a role access review, I have to go to Privileged Identity Management and then pick Azure AD or ARM, and then I can see an access review, and then I can create an access review for a particular role. So they are done in 2 different places, depending on is it a role or is it a group or app assignment. And then I just configure what it is, who's doing the review. So I select who are the reviewers. I can select, hey, is it a recurrence? So is it one time or is it some annual recurrence? How many times or how many occurrences or when does it end? Who's in scope of this? What's the role or app or group it's checking? And then whoever is delegated, be it the user, be it the manager, be it some delegated person, they go and do the review. And they can have actions. So the action might be, well, if you don't respond, you lose it. It could be you don't do anything, but you have control to go and now do that validation. So this is a very, very powerful feature to help try and keep things in check. So that's really the point of this. Okay, MFA. So passwords on their own are not good. We don't like passwords on their own. Passwords on their own make us basically sad. So what we're thinking about here, remember, is the whole point of authentication. That's really our focus. So if I shift over to the board for a second, let's come over here. So if I think, where should I draw? Let's go over here. I'm me. I can't remember, I keep drawing me as different colors. We've drawn me as orange this time. So I'm me, and if I think about authentication, how do I prove I am who I say I am? Well, it's something I know, a secret, a password, a PIN. It's something I have, my device. I have my phone. I have my PC, which has got a trusted platform module in it. I have a USB key. I have a hardware one-time password token. Or something I am. Facial recognition, 3D map, thumbprint, iris detection. And if we think of the methods I can use to actually authenticate, well, it could just be a password. And I could think about just being a password and we're sad. And we're really sad because that's terrible. Password on its own, I'm just opening myself up to misery. It's going to get compromised. People are very bad at choosing good passwords. So we don't like passwords on their own. If I enable multi-factor authentication, just straight away, it blocks a lot of the lazy attacks, the dictionary attacks, etc. So it blocks about 99.9% of attacks. Now, there are things to stop easy passwords on their own. There are things to say block simple passwords. So I can't use password. I can't substitute an S for a 5. It stops those things. I can add custom passwords. So in Azure AD P1 or above, I can add my own custom passwords to not allow. So there are things I can do. But if I do multi-factor authentication, it's so much better. Now, multi-factor authentication is a combination of those things. So the whole point here is, what is MFA? Well, MFA is 2 or more. So multi-factor authentication is multiple. Out of these things, it's typically 2 or more of those things. So it could absolutely be password, and let's do some various colors here. It could be password plus a text message or a phone call. Phone call is better than SMS because there's some other interaction, and this is okay. So we'll have a fairly stoic face. I don't know what I did with the eyes there, it's driving me nuts. Let's fix my eyes. So I'm sad. There's my sad face. As soon as I add in password and something else, hey, it's better. I mean, I guess maybe I should be a bit happier, but maybe I'm slightly smiling there. I go, all right, little smile there. Or I can use things like Authenticator application. Or some kind of one-time passcode, software or hardware. Now I'm happy. We like these. So that's another option. But you do need to use them sparingly. One of the things we'll see and we'll talk about is the idea that if you constantly ping someone for MFA, they'll just click yes. They'll get a muscle memory of clicking yes, and it's useless. At that point, you've lost because you prompt them so many times, they just click yes, they're not paying any attention. It's why the user access control in Vista was so poor, because it prompted you constantly, so you didn't care. So it was asking me yes, yes, this virus needs administrative permissions. Yes, just please don't show me this dialog again. Same thing with MFA. If you constantly prompt a user for everything, they're not going to think about it. What I want is to jar the user. They're not used to seeing prompts. It's like, wait, why am I being asked for this? Am I doing something? It snaps their attention because I'm intelligently using MFA. Hey, I'm doing something that's a higher privileged activity. Prompt them for MFA. I've detected something unusual about the behavior. The risk has increased. Let's make sure it really is. I'm snapping their attention. They're not getting fatigued because I'm constantly prompting them all of the time around this. Now, I do have control around the methods that we make available for our organization. If I was to go and look under my, let's jump over here. So I'm under Entra. It's going to be protect and secure authentication methods. And I can see policies about what I allow. So I've got all these different methods that I can enable for different groups of the population. So Authenticator app, that's a fantastic one. But also FIDO2 security keys. Also certificate-based authentication. There are other options available to me. And we're going to come back and talk about these in a second. But there's different things I can do and leverage in the organization. But that MFA fatigue is a real problem. So there are things we can do to block it. So firstly, you should be intelligent about when you prompt. Ideally, you're using some risk-based detection before you go and say, hey, you need to MFA. You don't prompt them. Never do user-enforced MFA where it prompts them constantly. MFA should be driven by some intelligence, ideally conditional access, maybe security defaults if I don't have premium licensing, but never just enforce it on a user. It's a terrible, terrible experience. It's not going to work very well. I want some heightened risk. But I'm concerned about that fatigue. So one of the nice things we can actually do is I can give a context to the user. So rather than it just popping up on their phone, say MFA, yes, it can give them the application that's requesting it. It can give them the location, and then they can't just type yes. They actually have to, well, when it prompts for an MFA, it will say there's a number. Please type this number into your application. And then on the Authenticator app, it will actually show me. So on the Authenticator app, well, it's confirming I am who I say I am, but it's saying, well, the app that's asking is this app. This is the location, and then I have to type in that number. And this does a number of things. So obviously, as the user, I'm like, wait, I'm not in Russia. That's odd. That's probably not me. I'm not using that app. That's probably not me. And even if I was still so didn't care, I'd have to not care enough that someone's trying to attack me. On the attacker's screen, it's showing them a number. I have no chance of guessing that. I mean, the odds will be astronomical. If I guess the same number, they deserve to get in because luck is in their favor. They deserve it. Let me. Kidding. But the whole point is, it's going to make it very hard for an attacker. I'm not going to accidentally type in the number that they have to have typed in. Now, that being said, if it's a really targeted attacker, this is still a possible target for a phishing attack. So a phishing attack is where this bad actor is actually maybe communicating with the user and they're tricking them. It's like, hey, I'm from your company. I don't believe you are who you say you are. I'm going to send you a challenge. I'm going to send you a challenge and I need you to type this number to prove you are who you say you are. And the user's like, oh, okay, I'm in trouble. Okay, I need you to type 13 to prove who you are. And they go, okay, 13. And then the attacker's like, fantastic. This is where user education is important as well. This is not phishing resistant. Some of the other ones we're going to talk about are phishing resistant. This one is not, because there's still a human as part of the interaction. There's still the chance that the human could be tricked by some bad actor who's here on this screen and is telling them to type in that number. So it's always good to educate users about, well, hey, look, if someone calls you and says they're from the IT department and then they're trying to get you to type, don't separately communicate, not via a means in the email or what they're telling you. Go and look up through a different means to get direct communication and validate that communication. So this is like an alternative to people asking for the password. People say, hey, I need you to prove who you say you are, type in this number for me. So it's not phishing resistant. But this is really powerful. And so this is going to be turned on by default. But right now in my Azure AD tenant, if I look at these authentication methods and look at Authenticator and go and look at Configure, I can see these. Hey, I require number matching, and I could do it for different groups and users. I'm going to show the application name, and also I'm going to show the geographic location. So I do have full control. I've turned it all on in mine, but I think by default, Microsoft is just going to be rolling this out to everyone. So this is a fantastic thing and should really help with that MFA fatigue and help reduce some of those phishing. But again, this is still possible to be attacked because there still is a user as part of the interaction. Anytime there's a user, well, there's a chance the user can be tricked. So, super useful. I do need Azure AD P1 to use MFA. Now, I did say before, on free, I can use the Authenticator app. Global administrators, I think, could also have that other SMS option. It's free if I use security defaults. So security defaults is an option that says, hey, I don't have premium P1, but I still would like to get some basic MFA available to me. And so in my tenant, if I have a free tenant, I can't get P1 or anything else. What I can actually do in my tenant is via the properties of my Azure AD, and there's every chance I'm not going to be able to find it in the Entra screen because I don't think I've ever tried to find it. Let's look at settings. So I'm going to go, I should look this up. But if I go to my Azure AD and look at properties, you notice at the bottom there's this link, Manage Security Defaults. So here I can turn on security defaults. So what that will do is it would open up that basic MFA for users. I get no control on where they're prompted, but Microsoft will make a decision. Hey, you're accessing the portal or the CLI. It's going to make them do an MFA. So it's better than nothing, but they can only use the Authenticator app. They can't do SMS text or phone, but I think global admins can. That's all in that document that goes through those exact options. But right, I don't want to use security defaults if I have P1. I want to use conditional access. But that's there and available. Passwordless is the best. Let's get rid of the password completely. So if I think about this picture again, my other option, and we're going to go to the, if I use a universal pen, it means I love this thing. The other thing is no password at all. Now, no password could be hello for business. So hello for business is using that trusted platform module in your machine. So it's something I have, because I've got the machine, and then I have to unlock that with maybe a PIN, something I know, or biometric, something I am. So it's two factors, it's a strong authentication. It could be I'm using a FIDO2 key. A physical key I have to put in the machine, it requires proximity, maybe I have to unlock it or something. It could be certificate-based authentication. I have a smart card with a cert and I have to insert in the machine. Notice all three of those, what was common in that factor? It was the machine performing the authentication. It was the TPM in the machine. It was a key inserted into the machine. It was a smart card inserted into the machine. So these three are considered phishing resistant. Because with these, a bad actor phoning up the user, there's not an easy way for them to say, hey, ship me your key, and I'm going to put it in my machine. It doesn't work remotely. Now, if the bad actor had software on the user's machine, right, there's things they could do, but it's a much more targeted, a much harder attack. So these are considered phishing resistant. The other passwordless is the Authenticator app. But as I talked about in the last screen, because it's a user typing in a number, technically they could be tricked. But this no password, this is like just joyous rapture scenario. Hands in the air, whoop, whoopee. They'd be saying yippee. This is what you really want to be doing. And when I talked about these strengths, and I talked about there's a difference between those, these are actually now exposed in Azure Active Directory. So if I was to go and look at my Azure AD, one of the things we actually now have, oops, didn't mean to do that, sorry, got the wrong screen. One of the things we actually have is this ability, let's see if I can find it, is I get these different authentication strengths that are available to me. And once again, I didn't actually look at where this is in Entra. Let me see if I can quickly go, let's see if we can see it really quick. Might find a conditional access maybe. Yeah, there it is, authentication strengths. So I have authentication strengths. And there are built-in ones. So I think there's 3 built in. And what you'll see here is just multi-factor authentication. That's the basic one. Then there's passwordless. Okay, that's nice, we talked about. And then phishing resistant. And you'll see for multi-factor, there's 17 options. And we can look at it. And it's everything. Hello for business, FIDO key, CBA, Authenticator app, temporary access pass, but also password and SMS, password and voice. Loads and loads of different options available to us. So lots of different things I can do here. But if I looked at passwordless MFA, now there's only 4. The 4 that we drew on the board. And then there's phishing resistant. Well, now it's dropped the Authenticator app for the reason I explained. So we have all of the control around this. I can create my own. I could add my own authentication strength with just the methods I want to allow. So I have a lot of control. And what we do with these, we can then use them in something called conditional access, which I'm about to talk about. But this is really, really powerful for us. Now, one other thing I did want to talk about is when we talk about password lists, well, how do I initially set up my machine? And so what we actually have is this thing called a temporary access pass. So I can generate a temporary access pass. This could be a one-time. I can configure how this works. I could generate a temporary access pass and maybe give it to the manager of the person who would give it to the user. They would bootstrap their authentication process with that temporary access pass. So I could generate a temporary access pass just for a particular user. I'm not even sure who I've created that for, but if I look at authentication methods, let's switch to that. I could add one, and I could create a temporary access pass for them. And then I would give that to the user, and they would use that one time to maybe onboard their machine to then go and set up, for example, Hello for Business. So temporary access pass is really useful in that scenario. So that's be how I can bootstrap and get that initial configuration if they don't have a password. So if there's no password, how do I get started doing anything? So temporary access pass can bootstrap that experience. Now, one of the challenges we have is, okay, I want multi-factor authentication. How does the user initially give the phone number, register the Authenticator app? Where are they doing that from? So there's always a concern about that initial registration. So what we can now do is, well, firstly, MFA registration is combined with self-service password reset. There's a site you can go to, and it's one registration for both, hey, I forgot my password, I want to reset, or hey, the methods to use for MFA. But there is that chicken and egg problem. Where do I register this? So I have to initially set up this information. And as a company, I'm like, well, I don't want that being set up from anywhere because it could be the bad actor, because that initial setup is maybe in a weakened security state because they've not set up MFA yet. Then a temporary access pass helps because somehow I had to give it to the user, but maybe it was intercepted. So what I can say is I can use conditional access, which helps control how I can do things, to say when I want to do security registration, I'm going to enforce these particular requirements on it. And there's actually a website to do the password reset. So what that conditional access lets me do is if I look at conditional access, which we're about to talk about in more detail, but I could actually create a new policy and I can target applications, but I can also target a particular type of user action, and I want to target registering security information. So I could create a policy just targeted at registering security information. And what I could say is, look, well, I'm going to grant it, but, well, maybe I'm going to require the device to be marked as compliant. So it has to be a corporate device. Maybe I'd require also a certain location. Maybe it has to be on a corporate network. I could do that. So that's the way we can now bootstrap in a secure way, just that initial onboarding of the secure information. Because before it was pretty difficult, I could really get in that chicken and egg situation. So conditional access, this is phenomenal. This is what gives a huge amount of power to Azure AD. The control of what apps you can use and when, what security, what configuration we have. So conditional access is always used. It doesn't matter how I'm authenticating it. If I'm using federation, it doesn't matter. It's still going to use Azure AD conditional access to be authorized to get to some app or service that trusts my Azure AD instance. It gives me a lot of rich controls around users and roles and the app and the environment before I can get access, but it is an Azure AD P1 feature. And the way this is going to work, And it's really important you understand this. All right, what color did I use for user? Orange. Orange user. I'm going to try and be a little bit consistent. So I have the user. And obviously we also have Azure AD, which is our identity provider. And then we have some app that I want to talk to. Say app 1. Now the way it works is, I might say, hey, I want to talk to you, please. Hey, it's going to say, I'm saying I want access. And it's going to say, I don't know who you are. No idea who you are. I need a token. So then the user will go to Azure AD. And it's going to authenticate. Now, if it's using password authentication, if it's using password hash sync, if it's a cloud native user, they're sending the credentials to Azure AD. If they were using federation, they sent their credentials to the federation service, who gave it the SAML token, and they're sending the SAML token now to Azure AD. But no matter what it is, they're now authenticating to Azure AD. And Azure AD is going to check that. And assuming that's good, Azure AD is going to create something called a refresh token and something called an access token. And the access token is specific to app 1. And it sends these back to the user. The user now takes that access token for app 1 and gives it to app 1. And app 1 says, yep, I trust that. You're good. You have access. But the whole problem is that time passes. Access tokens cannot be revoked in any normal way. Now, there is something called Continuous Access Evaluation, CAE. And what Continuous Access Evaluation does is the application has a relationship with the identity provider. It's bidirectional. The identity provider, Azure AD, can tell the app, hey, the user's been locked out. It's been disabled. The password's been reset. Invalidate that access token that they were using. And it can also send the app policies about location. Hey, this token is good for this location. But if you see the user changes location, don't trust the token anymore. If I do that, now I can revoke the token. We can make the access token longer lived. And I've got more information about this in other videos. But if not, because I can't revoke it, typically access tokens are time bombed. They're typically good for 1 hour and then it expires. So what happens is after that 1 hour, well, the user takes their refresh token that's good for a much longer period of time, goes back to Azure AD and says, hey, new one, please. Azure AD generates a refresh token that's got that, I think, the time can vary, but it's a long time. It's weeks, months. And it gives them a new access token, which is good for another hour for app 1, and sends these back. Oh, didn't mean to do that. What happened now? Let's get back to my board. That was weird. It goes back. And now I can give the new access token back to the application. If I wanted to access app 2, and this is why it's really interesting. If there was, I think it's really interesting. You think I'm sad. If there was an app 2, I don't have to go back to my federated service. If I want to talk to app 2, I take my refresh token and I ask Azure AD, hey, I now want a token for app 2, and it will create an access token for app 2 and give it to me. I don't have to go back to that other initial authentication. My refresh token can be used for everything. That's why we have a primary refresh token on our Windows devices that are joined. Our phones, if we have the Azure Authenticator app, that has a primary refresh token as our identity. So any apps that integrate in with the Authenticator app, I get single sign-on to those. So that's why it's really powerful. But the key point here is, notice everything, every app access is going via Azure AD. And conditional access surrounds that. Every authorization request, every ask for a token goes through conditional access. And so now I can think about, and I've got other videos, so I'm not going to go into detail, but a policy, as we saw, I give it a name. I can target particular users. I can target particular groups. I could target just guests. I could target particular roles, particular users, particular groups. I could exclude certain users and groups. It's always good to have a little bit of an emergency, especially when you start including everyone. Maybe exclude certain administrators. At least you have a break glass if something goes terribly wrong and you don't lock out your organization. I can target all apps. I could target particular apps. So I could target maybe just a certain Office application. Any application that is registered in my Azure AD tenant, any enterprise app that I have, I could target with a particular policy. And then I can have conditions. I can use that user risk, which is another Azure AD P2 feature that looks at the type of behavior, and then it has a risk level for the user and the individual sign-in. Well, I can use those risks here. I could evaluate the user's risk, i.e. their overall health and risk standpoint, based on real-time and offline factors, but I can also evaluate the individual sign-in. I can look at the device platform, both included and excluded. If it's Windows Phone, it's guaranteed to be something bad. I can create locations based on actually a number of different things. If I actually come out of conditional access for a second, we can define locations, and I can define locations based on both IP address and GPS. So if I'm on a mobile device, for example, hey, I can actually track my location not based on the IP address, but on what the GPS is telling where I actually am. Or I could set my own sets of IP ranges, so I can use all of those. I can also define terms of use, which are PDF documents. I have different things I can do here. If I go back to a policy again, so I can set all these different conditions. I could target particular apps. I could target particular devices. Maybe it's got a certain property. Maybe it's a saw machine. And then I have controls. Hey, do I want to grant it? Well, I'm going to grant it, but you must do an MFA. Or, not boring old MFA, you have to hit a certain strength. So I want passwordless MFA. I don't want SMS. I don't want phone. I want FIDO2. I want Hello for Business. I want CBA. I want Authenticator app. And this is where I can use those custom strengths that I define. Hey, the device has to be marked as compliant according to the MDM solution, i.e. Intune. It has to be hybrid joined. It must be an approved client app. I need an app protection policy, again, an MDM. I require you to change your password. I require you to have accepted the terms of use, those PDF documents. And I want all of them, or I require one of them. I can have control over those things. And I can just block access. There's also session controls. These might apply to things like, hey, I want to use a CASB solution. I want to lock down periodic sign-in reauthentication. I want to use that continuous access evaluation I talked about. So I have longer-lived access tokens because, hey, I'm going to have that communication. Maybe I don't want to use it. I could disable it. There's a whole bunch of things I can configure. And the point is you would go through and create these policies for your particular applications that match the requirements you have in your actual company. So these are very important things. So conditional access, fantastic. Okay, moving on. So B2B and B2C. Very often, I have my Azure AD tenant for my company. But I want to collaborate with partners, people that don't work for my company, so they don't have an account in my Azure AD. And I don't want to add an account in my Azure AD. That's bad for me, because now I'm having to maintain credentials in my Azure AD. I have to then maybe help desk if they forget their password. It's bad for the user because they have to now remember a different credential. And it's bad for their company because if they left the company, Well, their company is now scrambling to try and deactivate the account on my directory because I don't want them to access things. So no one wants multiple accounts. And so I can invite them into my Azure AD as a guest. So the way this now works is I can think that, scroll back over this way. So I've got my Azure AD. This is for my company. Remember, my Azure AD has my users and my groups. And all the applications that I use, all those software as a service, first-party and third-party apps, Azure, all of those other things, all trust my Azure AD instance. But now I've got partners. I've got these external people I want to collaborate with. I want to collaborate in SharePoint, Exchange Online, Azure resources, third-party apps. Now they have their own Azure AD, or they have Microsoft accounts, or they have a Gmail account, or they have maybe Facebook, or they have their own custom federation service, or maybe they have none of them. And then there's something called a one-time passcode I can do, where I basically email them a passcode they use to authenticate. And I can add these using B2B. So they show up as an external identity in my Azure AD. I can then add them to groups. I can grant them roles. It works the same way, but the key part is the authentication is happening here. Well, it's happening here for those. One-time passcode, I have to email them the passcode from my Azure AD. But the authorization, well, that's happening here. And so that's a big difference. They don't have a separate credential. They authenticate against their home identity provider. But the authorization, if I want strong authentication, well, I'm driving that. I have all the policy. I control those things. Now, I do have control now over, hey, who I can B2B. Let's make it a bit clearer. There was something called cross-tenant access settings. So cross-tenant access settings let me control who from my company can be added as guests in other companies, and also control which other companies can be invited to be guests in my company. And do I trust their strong authentication? So if they've done an MFA already or password list, they have a strong auth, I'm not going to make them do it again. I'm going to trust they did a good job on that. So I now have control of all of those things. If I jump over, so firstly, I can go and look at let's go over here. Let's see if I can find it in Entra. If I can't, oh, there we go. External identities, there we go. So in external identities, well, firstly, I can do the identity providers. And you'll notice these are the ones that I have. So I've enabled, obviously, Azure AD and Microsoft account, one-time passcode, Facebook, and Google. But I could also go and add some custom SAML or WS-Fed. So they're all the types of guests I can have. But then I can have cross-tenant access settings. So there's default configuration. So it's just default settings. And my default is basically I'm allowing collaboration to external users and apps. Direct Connect is used by Teams today, and that's all blocked. And there's no trust for inbound. Outbound, all are allowed as well. But I can then add, for specific organizations, different settings. So here for onboard to Azure, for inbound, for trust, I'm going to trust MFA, compliant and hybrid. So maybe they're a company I've purchased. So they have a different Azure AD, but I actually trust all of their checks they're doing. So now I'm not going to make them redo authentication against my tenant if they're added as a guest. Likewise, I might say for certain organizations, I'm blocking it. So I allow everyone except this dodgy looking company. So I'm not going to let them be added as guests if they're from this company. So I'm specifically blocking those. Likewise, I might say outbound access. I'm blocking outbound to this, so my users cannot be added as a guest to this organization. So it now gives me a lot of control using those cross-tenant access settings. So there's some nice things this opens up to us. So that's B2B, the people I want to collaborate with. And they just show up, I should have shown this, sorry. They will just show up in my Azure AD. So I've added a bunch of guests. Now they will show up as a guest by default. So you'll see this member type is guest, just those different types of tracking I can do. So you can see here I've got a Yahoo account. Well, that's going to use identity as a mail. So that's using one-time passcode. It will email them each time. But I've got other guests. Well, some of them is an external Azure AD. Some of them are a Facebook identity. I've got some that will be, there's another mail, there's a Google down here. One of them is using phone, so I get a text message. That's not a guest, that's actually a member of my own. So different things I can do. But we can see I've got all these different types. Now, I could make a guest a member. They don't have to be guests. Again, it could be I've purchased this company, but they're a different Azure AD tenant. I haven't merged them together yet, but I want to treat them as if they're one of my company. Then there's B2C. B2C are my customers. I'm writing an app. Customers want to be able to use my app, but most of the time they have their own social identity already. They want to use that social identity. They don't want a different identity. Or maybe they don't have a social identity. They trust me to share. They want a local account. But I do not want them in my Azure AD. So we can create a separate Azure AD instance of B2C. And we saw that when we tried to create an Azure AD earlier. Now, I will say there's a lot of unification happening here. I don't know if over time they'll merge, but more and more features of B2C, for example, are coming into B2B, like user flows to control the flow of the onboarding. That's coming into Azure AD regular now as well. But what I would do with B2C is they're my customers. They're not people I'm collaborating with. And the customers have their social identity. Well, I create a completely separate, and it's specifically of a type B2C. And with B2C, their social identity gets added in using B2C, or they can create a local account. That's a facility of B2C. It lets me customize every pixel. I can have all these flows about it. And if we jump over, what I'll need to do here is I'll have to change to my B2C instance. And what we'll see is so I'm now in my B2C. My authentication methods, I have this whole idea. Hold on. Policies, sorry. Under policies, I have identity providers. And there is a lot of them. Notice it's very different from B2B. It's all based around these social identities. So I can say which one of these I want to allow with B2C. But notice there is also a local account. So if they don't have a social identity or don't want to share it with my store or my app, I can let them just sign up for a local account directly in my environment. But I can create user flows. There's whole sets of capabilities around all of this functionality. So this is where I could then create my B2C instance. My app would trust this B2C instance, and users can just happily use their own social identity. There's also entitlement management. There's lifecycle workflows. And entitlement management is all about, I can create access packages that consist of group memberships, that consist of applications, that consist of SharePoint sites. And what I can say is only certain people can request that package, or maybe the package is assigned to them. So this is a P2 feature again. Let's just switch back to my regular Azure AD. not my B2C. And under my entitlement management, I can just create access packages. And these are just groups of resource roles. And you can see I can add groups, applications, SharePoint sites, and then I can create policies around who can request it. How long does this last? So I can have who can request it in my directory, not in my directory. I can say particular domain names. I could get information that I'm going to want from them. Is it time bombed for an amount of time I get this package for? Does it require an access review? There's whole things I can do. I can require approval before this goes through. So these entitlement management is a great way to assign things at a large level to groups of people. And then we have lifecycle workflows. So these automate tasks about onboarding people and then offboarding people. So it's those two scenarios today. So if I jump back over here again, we'll see this idea of lifecycle workflows, and we'll see it has templates. So I can create a workflow based on joiners. So before they join, the day they join, and then termination, before someone leaves, as they leave, after they leave. And for each of these, there's different types of tasks I can perform. So if it's a pre-hire, maybe my task is just to create a temporary access pass and send it to the manager. But there's other tasks I could add as well. Send a welcome email, add a user to a team, remove, enable an account. So there's all these different types of tasks that I can just select, and these will then automatically trigger this workflow based on a filter that I can define on who it applies to. So lifecycle workflows, again, help with that idea of there's stages people go through, and it helps automate that, removes the human element having to perform those things. So the final thing, what about Active Directory in Azure? So good old-fashioned Active Directory, not Azure AD, but I've got Azure Virtual Networks. I've got resources that want to use Active Directory. So how do I use that in my AD environment? Now, Active Directory is probably not going anywhere for a really, really long time. What if you don't have Active Directory, but I need regular Active Directory in Azure? So there is something called Azure AD Domain Services. It provides a managed Active Directory that does sync from Azure AD. Now, this is the only time you can do this. Because it's managed, it synchronizes objects from a Azure AD into an AD. There's very limited flow the other way though. So now it doesn't flow from this managed AD to Azure AD. And I can have replicas. I think I can have 5 replicas in total on 5 different virtual networks where it can have these managed domain controllers. But they all must be meshed. I have to have complete peering between all the virtual networks. But it then provides me with NTLM. It provides me with Kerberos. It provides me with LDAP. There's limited control over these. There's limited administrative capabilities, but it would provide me an Active Directory in Azure that I don't really have to do much management around. So that service exists. It is definitely there. But if I had my own AD already, typically what I'll do is I'll just extend it into Azure. And I can even automatically join machines to that Active Directory if it exists through extensions to the virtual machine. So what this would look like, if I actually go back to my original picture here, so you've got your regular Active Directory. Imagine I've then got my Azure subscription. So I'll draw it over here and I've got a space. So this is now just Azure. And what I have in Azure is a virtual network. So I've got a VNet. Now remember, a VNet is an IPv4 CIDR range. It's a set of IP addresses. Now, providing I've got some connectivity, I've got a tunnel. That tunnel could be a site-to-site VPN. It could be ExpressRoute private peering, i.e. there's an IP path between them. Well, this is just a location, remember. This is its own IPv4 range. So this Active Directory and these domain controllers, well, they sit on their own CIDR range, say CIDR 2. If I connect these networks together, what I could do is on this virtual network, I could configure its DNS to be custom, and it could point to the IP addresses of these domain controllers. So I could just point my DNS that way to use these. Or I might extend my Active Directory in. I might actually create some domain controllers in here. So then I'd point my DC to those domain controllers. Now, if I was to do this, one thing I definitely want to do is for my Active Directory, I would add a new site. Sites are defined by CIDR ranges, remember? So I'd add this CIDR range that represents this VNet as a site, Azure South Central, and then I'd create a site link based on this connection between these, so the AD replication would work correctly. But I could absolutely just extend my Active Directory by adding domain controllers. If I have a lot of things in Azure that are using Azure AD, sorry, regular AD, I'll probably want to extend my AD into Azure. And that was it. So that was our identity. I know obviously we covered a lot. And again, I've got deep dive videos in the channel about all of this stuff. But yeah, that's the end of this module. Thank you.